Well, thank you for that introduction. It was very nice of you. I am very grateful to Azim Premji University uh, for inviting me and asking me to give this talk. Uh, this talk I am developing partly since I worked as the chief statistician for a while and being engaged with issues of statistics and numbers for much longer than that, uh, represents a whole range of thoughts which have come to me. It draws in many ways from a regular monthly column I write in Mint on looking at issues as a statistician. And I take liberties with that theme in different ways. So I'll be using some of those ideas in fleshing out the concepts and ideas which I develop in this talk. So I want to speak about something that quietly influences almost all public debates, policy decisions, perception of national progress, yet we very rarely examine them closely. And that's the gap between numbers and narratives. That's really what I'm going to be discussing. I'm going to look at how numbers are constructed and how they interface with the narratives which are constructed around these numbers. Uh, so, numbers are everywhere. I mean, in the introduction, you talked about the 8.2% GDP, and you're more than welcome to question me about it. Hopefully, by the end, you may want to change the questions to other things also. So, all of them are there. Inflation, poverty estimates, unemployment, each one of these engages people in debates. Some of them have taken place here. There are issues which regularly come up. They influence our thinking about public policy. They guide people's perception about the economy and society. So they're clearly very important. But behind every number, there is a story. The story is about how it was constructed, what assumptions went into it, what are the limitations which it carries, what is that number actually capable of measuring, and what sometimes, and I will talk a little bit about it, what it ends up being used for, which are often not quite the same. Uh, these stories, unfortunately, remain invisible, and we tend to think of numbers as sacred. I mean, there's a tendency to people to think of numbers as being objective, very scientific, and there's a tendency to use numbers to strengthen your case, even though what lies behind them are often very subjective processes. And it is that, hopefully, I will try to bring out to you in different forms. Narratives, in contrast, are different. They take shape very much faster than measurement. They influence interpretation even before all the evidence is in, and they have a great deal of persistence. So, a good narrative will often stay on much longer than the empirical validity on which it was built. I'm not necessarily going to be able to bring all of those out, but some of that will come out in the course of this lecture. So, I'm going to explore this relationship between them and try to sort of give you a sense of perspective on how and to read numbers and how to think about the narratives which surround them. So I'll draw, for the purposes of this lecture, on three types of statistics, three major areas of statistics. The first is poverty measurement. The second is GDP, which you talked about, and I will have some things to say about that. And lastly, I'll talk about inflation. I could have done this with many other numbers as well, and I have in the past picked up employment. There are other types of numbers which are there, and also behind every number, there's often similar stories going on. But for purposes of our discussion, I'll limit myself to these three, which I think will give enough scope for discussion as well. So let's start with poverty itself. Poverty numbers are thought to serve multiple roles, primarily three types of roles. The first role which we assign to poverty numbers is purely descriptive. That is, they are to capture and describe how people actually live. revealing their income, nutrition, housing, education, health, and access to basic services. A descriptive measure, therefore, needs richness and nuance. It must help us understand how people experience deprivation. A second purpose which we have behind the poverty number is prescriptive. We would like to identify who qualifies for special treatment, special benefits, and so on, who should access government support or welfare programs. So we want to make the number operational. It should be easy to implement. It should simplify complex realities into a simple, easy to use cutoff or threshold. A third purpose with which we use poverty is something which links to my story on narratives. They become tools in public debate and public discourse. The number shapes the narrative. Have we done better? Has this government done better than that government? How are we today relative to sometime else in the past? Mobilize opinion, benchmark performance. State X is doing better than state Y. All sorts of things are there. So each one of these different uses demands something very different from the number. In one case, nuance, in the other case, simplicity, and in the third case, rhetorical strength. It's difficult to find a single number which meets all the three requirements. Sometimes we sacrifice nuance for simplicity, and sometimes we sacrifice both for rhetorical argument. So it's something which you need to keep in mind, that we are putting too much load onto a single number, and we don't often realize how limited that number is. Poverty itself is now probably the history of measuring poverty is about 150 years old or thereabouts. The earliest work in poverty was by Charles Booth. He did a study of London in 1886. He was followed by the work of Rowntree, who expanded this work and made a very influential publication called Poverty, a Study of Town Life. This publication appeared in 1901. For many people, these two mark the beginning of modern measurement of poverty. And much of what they did was formed the basis of how subsequent measurement techniques evolved. Interestingly enough, in the same year, a slightly different approach to poverty measurement, and also very influential, was also written. Dadabhai Naoroji wrote his famous book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Unlike Booth and Rowntree, his work was not grounded in surveys. Dadabhai Naoroji's goal was explicitly political. He wanted to challenge the dominant narrative of the time that British rule was bringing prosperity to India. He wanted to show that it was not bringing prosperity to India. So using official statistics from jail records, letters from administrators and so on, he compiled a poverty estimate to demonstrate that Indians were becoming poorer, not richer. So I am sort of showing that this is how poverty has evolved. There were, at the same time, two different approaches to measure poverty were taken. One explicitly for narrative control, the other as developing a scientific measure, and our legacy of poverty measurement goes back to that. In India, subsequent to Dadabhai Naoroji, the freedom struggle had numerous discussions of poverty. In fact, one of the strongest arguments made for independence was that we will be able to set up positive programs for poverty eradication and alleviation. Ending poverty was the moral justification for independence. In spite of that, for 30 years after independence, we did not have an official measure of poverty. That's an interesting, if you like, commentary on the the independence dialogue and the post-independence development strategies which evolved. In 1971, Mrs. Gandhi comes to power from an election which had the iconic phrase, "Garibi Hatao," And subsequently, after that, the Planning Commission takes note of it, and as part of the work for the sixth plan, they set up a committee under Professor Y.K. Alak called the Task Force on Projections. A very interesting title. It's reflective of how government think. It says the Task Force on Projections of Minimum Needs and Effective Consumption Demand. The report of this task force essentially defined our first official poverty line. This was built on the works of Professors Dandekar and Rath, who had laid out essentially the same approach, which they updated with more recent data. And using the NSS survey of 1973, using calorie norms, which had been developed by ICMR, they established national and state level poverty lines. The critical thing to note here is the date for which the data was compiled. The data was from 1973. The 1970s were the period when, early 1970s, when we actually get the consolidation of the Green Revolution, the expansion to HYV varieties in rice, the coverage to states other than Punjab and Haryana. All of this happens in the early to mid 70s. This leads to rapid availability of improvements in food availability and sharp reductions in food deprivation. This creates a phenomenon that the official measured line starts showing very sharp declines in poverty, starting from virtually when the line was released. The measurement was completed in 79. By the time we hit 1990, the official measure was showing very sharp reductions in poverty. Since the decline clashed with the narrative of pervasive widespread poverty in the country, a view was taken that the norm needs to be revisited. So an expert group under Professor Lakdawala revisited the norm, found number of technical improvements which could be done, and the 1993 official poverty line was given. They were. I'm not saying that the improvements were not correct. They were correct, but it's also important to keep in mind the context in which the improvements were being made. But the methodology still remained anchored in the same data source, which is NSS Household Consumer Expenditure Survey. It remained basically anchored to the same basic premise of a poverty norm linked to food insufficiency. As the food security continued to improve, the reductions in poverty, even by the revised line, had become quite marked. This led the government in 2006 to set up another committee under Professor Tendulkar, which gave its report by 2009. Even as the report was released and its outcomes calculated, it conflicted with the widespread perception of persistent poverty, and therefore they felt another committee must be set up. So a third committee was set up under Professor Rangarajan, which also modified the norm, but all of them had one common characteristic. They continued to be anchored in the Household Consumer Survey of NSS. This language of poverty decline, I mean, the data showing systemic decline, regardless of which norm you use, you could start with the Alak committee as it was done in 79. You could do with the modified Lakdawala norm in 93. You could with Tendulkar. You could go to Rangarajan. The levels would change, but the sharp decline would happen across all of them. The roots of that sharp decline is that because all of these are linked to household consumption, food plays an important element. The role of food is reduced in subsequent revisions, but food continues to play a central element. Food availability had become very easy. In fact, by 2013, the passage of the National Food Security Act meant that close to 80 crore individuals were receiving subsidized, maybe free food grains, which effectively meant old-style food insecurity was irrelevant. This is the reality against which the debates on whether NSS has done, the debates took on a peculiar form that NSS has done something wrong, maybe the data is not right, because the narrative needed to change, but the narrative was still being held to where it was. I'm now going to talk to you about ways in which we could interpret this disconnect and suggest ways both of changing the measurement protocols and the narrative to help reach a resolution to this problem. The first problem which I would like to highlight is poverty is fundamentally a status variable. It's what in economist term I will call it's like a stock. It's something which you perceive about yourself or about anything that I am deprived for a following reason. Consumption is a flow variable. I can measure poverty through consumption expenditure, I can do it through an income survey, but both of these are fundamentally flows. A flow measurement is done in any survey over a short reference period of either a week or a month, and it provides a snapshot in the time in which the survey instrument was canvassed. In India, where most workers are engaged in informal, seasonal, or irregular employment, income and consumption can and do fluctuate dramatically across the year sometimes. A worker may earn well during some part of the year and will face deprivation in other parts of the year. A household may appear above the poverty line at the time of the survey, maybe below at other times of the year. Consumption at a single point of time does not capture this volatile nature of vulnerability or risk which a household encounters at the margin. So, we need measures which will distinguish between these types of things and try to look for permanent escapes or resilience, which is not being possible under the current measurement protocols. In addition to the stock versus flow thing, there are also structural changes which have taken place. India is becoming more urban today. It's estimated now by various people that the urbanization rate when the census is conducted may well be 40%. Some argue it may be even more. It's becoming older. It is possible that the elderly population, by the time the next census is conducted, may well be over 20% plus, 25% or so. It was 10% in 2011. In this transformed period, a number of other things have become important. Expenditure on healthcare, which is a critical matter for elderly people. Expenditure on transport, which is very important in urbanized settings. Expenditure on education, which continues. We still have a very large young population. Expenditure on education is a very important part of people's aspirations and a source of feeling deprived. The newer technologies, access to digital world, expenditure on data is also becoming significant. In fact, the recent household consumption survey says that these expenditures may be as much as 20 to 30% of a household budget. Traditional poverty lines have not been able to take into account that these can also be forms of deprivation. You can have enough to eat, but you're not in a position to take care of your children's education. You can't provide them with the requirements to take private tuition. For example, increasingly, education expenditure, in the 70s when they thought about it, they said, oh, but government schools are for free, so we don't have to worry about education. And government provides free healthcare in public health centers, so we don't have to provide. But government education and government health are not the major sources by which people obtain these services. Even at the lowest income levels, people are looking for private tuition. They look for treatment often because government facilities are overwhelmed or don't have the resources from private sources. So there's a lot of out-of-pocket expenditure on health. So while it can meet its minimum nutritional standards, it may still be deprived because it can't meet its school fees, it can't meet its healthcare requirements, and so on. So we need, for example, to think about a poverty norm which moves beyond what was being developed in the 70s, and we need to do this in a positive way. It's important to sort of say, yes, that was a norm which was relevant in the 70s, we have made progress in it, but that is no longer relevant anymore. We have other things which we need to talk about. Interestingly enough, in a very, I do mean to make this as a sideline, Niti Aayog did try to solve this a little in a certain way. They introduced the multidimensional poverty index partly with a view to get away from this point of time dependence on a consumer expenditure survey. The multidimensional poverty index is actually much more focused on stocks. It has much more focus on assets which people have. But even so, some confusion between stocks and flows persists in the multidimensional poverty index itself. But multidimensional poverty index has another problem. And it's a problem which we should be sensitive to in the context of measuring indicators for public policy. Government schemes for access to housing, Jan Dhan Yojana, access to bank accounts, schemes targeted to reduce infant mortalities, the Janani Yojana and so on and so forth, which have tried to promote institutional delivery, provide care for maternal health and so on, have significantly improved certain key indicators in the MDPI. Now here we encounter a phenomenon which is talked about a lot when we talk about social sciences and statistics. There's a thing called Goodhart's law. This is based on the work of Charles Goodhart, who was a macroeconomist, and he talked about money supply definitions as they interfaced with monetary policy indicators. But that's not the one I'm talking about. The law has said that when a measure, the phrasing of the law which social scientists have developed says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be an effective measure. Let me give you two examples before returning back to MDPI of some things which have a similar flavor to Goodhart's law, of application of Goodhart's law. One is, of course, the famous World Bank ease of doing business indicators. Famous or infamous as you may like. Governments, World Bank promoted it, governments fell in love with it, everybody started to improve their ease of doing business, and the interface between governments and World Bank led to a whole bunch of scandals which ultimately ended up with World Bank stopping that exercise because they realized it was not working. But it was a practical application of Goodhart's law at work. Another example is taking place now. The Sustainable Development Goals have an indicator on gender equality, gender empowerment, and one of the measures provided for it is the number of women who have access to mobile phones. Now, governments want to show improvement on their SDG goals, so they've all started schemes to give women mobile phones. So the women have mobile phones, so the indicator improves, but the ground reality doesn't change very much. So the point is, once governments start using multidimensional poverty indicators as a performance target, they set their policy on that, they use it to compare states, they set political goals on it, or simply use it to claim success, the indicator starts suffering from the same weaknesses because you will target the instruments rather than the underlying problem. Now the resolution is there. You need to be dynamic in your development of the indicator. You have to keep shifting your indicator, not stay with the same one. And maybe, because the descriptive role collapses if it becomes an object of government policy. So the poverty debate in some sense illustrates the challenges of doing measurement in a strategic world. I mean, it has many elements to it. The persistence of narrative, the fact that we need to revise the narrative itself, recognize achievements and move on. Unfortunately, when narratives get linked to political dialogue, nobody wants to concede any space. The fact is, we are much better fed today. We are better clothed today. The, it doesn't take much to agree to saying, yes, this has happened. Let's move on and let's develop a different indicator and let's see what the status is and let's use those to describe our problems and policy. The message from this part, and I move to the next up, is numbers are not neutral. Every statistic reflects choices about what is counted and what is left out. Measurement needs to evolve. We can't stay fixed to a particular approach to measurement. And much more importantly, we must recognize that reality is complex and we should be willing to work with a multiplicity of measures trying to describe things, not try to look for a single number to describe all ills. I mean, that is really at the heart of all of this. If we recognize these limits, we could do a much better job with poverty measurement, which is still a challenge. It's just that you need to define the challenge better in the context of what is being done today. The second one, which I'll turn to, and I'll be shorter here, is GDP. Now, GDP itself has a very short but very interesting history. GDP was developed in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets. In response to the Great Depression, the US Congress asked him to develop a single measure which could describe economic activity, and this measure was developed. He very carefully pointed out that this is really a comprehensive measure of economic activity. Don't try to do it for too many other things. But as we will see, that doesn't quite happen. It became a symbol of national performance. At the Bretton Woods Conference, it was agreed to use GDP as a way of developing national performance. It allowed countries to gain political legitimacy. The United Nations Statistical Commission therefore formalized the system of national accounts, which laid down the methodology for GDP calculation. And three major revisions happened after. The first one was released in 1953. Three major revisions of that basic system happened in 1968, 1993, and 2008. We also began GDP measurement virtually at the same time. A committee under Professor Malanobis with Professors V.K.R.V. Rao and Dr. Gadgil were set up to formalize India's system of GDP measurement. The report of that committee basically marks India's formal government measurement of GDP. The work was transferred to CSO, and CSO has subsequently been measuring GDP in line with their recommendations, also keeping in mind the evolution in global standards as they happened. So CSO released the first series with base of 1949, then it revised the base in 60-61, then again in 70-71, 80-81, 93-94, 99-2000, 2004-5, and the last revision happened in 2011-12. Another revision is now promised for 22-23. Each revision improved the methodology, added in more data sources, updated the basket of goods and services, and continued to improve alignment with the international norms. I will talk to you about the 2011 series and some of the narratives which grew around the 2011 series, partly because I was personally engaged with that exercise. And many people ask questions about it, so I thought let me pose some of them. Others may come up in the question answer session and we can take them up if they do. Formal work in the 2011 series begins in 2013. Implicit work for it begins actually in 2009. These two dates are very important because the first 2009 predates my becoming chief statistician. Actually, some of the initial steps for the revision had already been taken by my predecessor. The formal exercise of constituting the committee and the working groups which worked on the revision began in 2013. The results were declared in 2015. But something very interesting happened. In the middle, in 2014, the government changed. A new political party came to power. A large part of the debate on the numbers when they came out were focused on this government has done this. One of the things which happens with a lot of debates on numbers is we give too much emphasis to political breakpoints and not enough to the institutional processes which lie before them. Much of the changes which were there in the 2014-11 revision were actually talked about and urged for well before the government change had taken place and had their roots in those dialogues which are taking place. But the narrative and the rhetoric which built up around the revision leads one to conclude that this government did this in order to make themselves look better or make the other government look worse, or so on and so forth, which is really not the case. So what happened, and I'll take up one example, maybe two, to illustrate what happened. One of the areas in Indian GDP measurement which had been a persistent source of unhappiness was our measurement of the organized sector, what we used to call the organized sector in Indian accounts. Now, I'm not saying informal sector, because informal sector measurements continued to be a problem even in the 2011 revision. I'll talk a little bit about that. But the organized sector was supposed to be one for which more data was available. But in fact, organized sector measurement in India was very, very limited, and it built up from data availability differently in different sectors. So for example, in manufacturing, we identified organized with registration under the Factories Act. And any entity which was registered under the Factories Act was treated as organized, data for which was captured from the annual survey of industries and incorporated into national accounts. In others, different routes were taken. For many other entities, corporates were the basis for treating them as organized, and corporate data, for the most part, was collected from a Reserve Bank of India's idiosyncratic survey of the private corporate sector. I'm saying idiosyncratic because it was not a statistical survey. It was a purposive survey meant to guide RBI with an understanding of the financial performance of companies, but the data also allowed you to calculate information on value added and so on. What we were able, now this was insofar as, sorry, I should complete. This was not all. There were other idiosyncratic things in national accounts which were used for measuring organized sector. For example, in the transport field, organized was linked to motor vehicles. So motor vehicles transport was treated as part of the organized sector, and large part of the value added in transport sector which was classified under organized was motor vehicles transport. Construction total value added was then and later primarily estimated from a commodity flow meters. Output of key raw materials like bricks, steel, cement were converted through input-output methods to an aggregate output and value added, which was then allocated to households and corporates through some rules. But fundamentally, that was how construction value added was calculated and continues to be done in both the old and the 2011 series as well. What changed in 2011 substantially was a new data became available. In 2006, Government of India introduced the online filing of corporate returns, and companies were encouraged on a phased manner to submit their accounts instead in form of physical paper copies at the registrar's office in an online portal. By 2010-11, this had become virtually universal, covering all companies. So we had, in fact, a rich database describing the entire corporate sector. The procedural shift we made was to shift measuring value added from the corporate sector directly from the MCA database. This had a huge impact. It improved our measurement of organized sector quite significantly. And in fact, the share of value added attributed to organized activity jumped in the 2011 revision for this reason. Uh, the logic was linked to what I just said. It was a comprehensive coverage of the entire corporate sector. What it did was it made our aggregate estimate more reliable, more complete, because the earlier method was patchy, things got left out. The old ASI for some, RBI corporate for others, mixture of some things for yet others, meant that there were things which fell in the cracks between them. This ensured that we had a comprehensive, complete measurement of corporate value added. Our aggregate estimates improved considerably. What we lost was precision, or the quality of precision in the sectoral estimates. Now, why does this happen? See, much of the corporate sector is dominated by conglomerates which have presence in multiple sectors. So let me take an example, and this is purely for the purposes of descriptive example. Say a company like Reliance. It is a single corporate entity under the name Reliance Industries Limited. It has presence in petrochemicals. It is present in marketing. It's present in trade. It has a presence in a large number of activities. And until it hives off these activities into separate companies, it's a single thing. ITC. They have tobacco, they have hotels. The hotels have now been separated out, but earlier they had hotels. They had paperboard, packaging, agriculture, a whole bunch of things under a single corporate umbrella. The value added for all these segments would be assigned, as per the rules we did, to the activity which was the dominant activity of the company. So see what happened? There is an imprecision built in. Our aggregate is better, but the components, which is manufacturing versus services, is imprecise. That limitation is there, and we will talk about it at the end briefly. So this is what the revision did. But because the revision changed both levels, and also it has so happens affected growth rates, the perception was driven more by the politics of the time rather than by the logic of what the measurement protocols were done. Okay, I'll skip some of the others and move on. We have since then made more progress. In fact, one of the things which we will expect to see, and the public press release by Mosby suggests that will in fact happen, is informal sector earlier was measured episodically by NSS surveys, consumption expenditure, labor force surveys, enterprise surveys. The estimates are pooled together to generate value added in the unincorporated sector. And these surveys used to typically happen once every 5 years. Last time, so 2011 used the surveys which were done close to that time. Now, both employment and unincorporated sectors are annual surveys. In fact, employment comes out monthly and the unincorporated sector comes out annually. By shifting measurement to use these surveys, we will make our informal sector estimates more reliable and more timely. So the old criticism of our informal sector is anchored in the base year and subsequently growth is misestimated will no longer be a major problem. So this is something which is certainly happening. What we have not yet seen signals for, and hopefully will happen in the future, is the problem I told you about corporate accounts, that you can't drill down into establishment level activity. There is a database which permits you to do that, but that database is not being used as yet for statistical work. The GST data matches with corporate accounts because built into every GST filing is the PAN number of the establishment which is filing the GST return, and the PAN number is also linked to corporate accounts because every company's PAN numbers are also linked to their corporate registration. It is in principle possible using GST data to map the corporate accounts on to establishment level value added without any further work, without additional infrastructure of a new survey or something. If this is done, we would be able to bridge the establishment versus enterprise problem, which currently bedevils our estimates in terms of descriptive quality. I would like to close the GDP story. There are other elements in GDP. One of them is this thing about the real versus nominal. I mean, I think it was implicit in when I was introduced by saying is the 8.2% estimate a real. The growth is it believable or not? Part of the problem happens because there is a belief that our estimates, at least for corporate, start off as nominal and are then converted into fixed price estimates by applying a deflator. And for a large part of the GDP, that is about the corporate estimates, that's certainly true. But for the remainder, which is agriculture, construction, it's actually the other way around. We start with quantitative numbers and convert them to nominal by applying them to prices. But there is a perception that our deflators are not accurate. That, unfortunately, is what I want to turn to next and then return back to this theme a little bit, is our inflation measurement story. Because there is a persistent feeling that we all suffer from inflation. Actually, inflation is no longer a problem of the form it used to be. Let's talk about what is inflation. There are three broad tools which we have available to us for measuring inflation. There is the consumer price index, there's the wholesale price index, and there's the GDP deflator. The consumer price index, let me first step back a little. Macroeconomics talks about inflation as a measure of the movement in the aggregate price level. It doesn't give you so when macroeconomists and monetary economists worry about inflation, they worry about a movement of something called the aggregate price level. The trouble is there is no, on the ground in the economy as a whole, there's no such thing as the aggregate price level. There are prices, there are multiple prices. They can be prices of final goods and services, which are measured in part by an index called the consumer price index. This reflects the consumption basket of the median consumer. Items which enter his consumption basket are captured in the consumer price index. Now, the median consumer in India is somebody whose substantial expenditure is still on food. Even with the revised and updated household consumer expenditure survey, the median consumer is still spending a very large chunk of his income on food. It's only when you reach the upper income deciles or upper expenditure deciles that non-food starts playing a very important role. Therefore, the index which represents the median consumer is very different from the index which affects other groups in society. Say the group which is present here will often not be in sync with the inflation experience of the median consumer. There is another index available which is more comprehensive, which is the WPI. Now, the WPI is a very old index. WPI measurement in India started sometime in the 1930s. And between 1930s and 1970s, India was, along with most countries in the world, capturing WPI. It's primarily an index of commodity prices at the largest point of sale. From the 70s onwards, many countries in the world started shifting to something called a producer price index. The major difference between the WPI and the producer price index is that the producer price index talks about the prices received by the producer of goods and services. The first one was primarily commodities. We have now added it into it services as well. And secondly, it's the price received by the producer. The difference between these two is small. It's primarily the taxes which are levied between the point of production and the point of sale on goods and services. These are your indirect taxes. Now, India continues to measure WPI. It has made one improvement to WPI, that is, for manufactured goods, we now capture prices at what is received by the manufacturer, which is we don't include excise or indirect taxes in it. But for others, it is still at the wholesale price level, so intermediate taxes are there. For agricultural commodities, it still includes some of the taxes which go into building up the agriculture market. But WPI does not have services. So it's a very comprehensive indicator, but it doesn't have services. The GDP deflator is a synthetic number which is constructed sectorally by using prices of the underlying items, and where service prices are not available, they look at the closest price they can get to the service price. So sometimes it is from WPI, sometimes it is from CPI, and a composite synthetic indicator which lies between WPI and CPI is constructed. These three indicators capture reality very differently. In periods of generalized inflation where all prices are moving up and down, as was the case in the 1970s, as was the case in 1990, or as was the case recently during COVID and the Ukraine war, all the three indicators move in sync. But there are other times when price movements are heterogeneous. The heterogeneity in price movement has increased since the last 2 decades. The formation of the WTO and the growth of global trade and global value chains has meant that for most commodities, most tradable commodities, there is a significant, if you like, integration of markets. So prices for these are determined very close to global averages. Now, where global trade is stagnant or the demand is damp, prices will not move up. Right now, we have a situation that in most tradable commodities, there is huge excess supply. So, for the most part, WPI tends to be, because it is largely tradables, show very low growth rates. The exceptional periods happen when the Ukraine war happened and there was a breakdown in global supply chains, or when COVID happened and there was a breakdown in global supply chains, suddenly global prices spike up. Sometimes something will happen in Yemen and petroleum prices may spike, so that component of the trade basket will rise. But fundamentally, WPI for the last 2 decades or so is linked to what is happening to the global market in tradable commodities, and therefore that inflation has been low, sometimes negative. CPI has a significant basket of non-tradables. In India, there are trade restrictions on agricultural goods, and most services which enter final consumption are non-tradable. So if you put the two together, CPI has a significant non-tradable component which is volatile. It's principally influenced by things like climate and weather. So what we have is an indicator which is averaging between the two, which is the GDP deflator. Now, today, because both CPI and WPI are very low, the GDP deflator is actually very low, and the 8.2% GDP therefore is correct. What people are not appreciating is that the nominal GDP growth is also 8.7%, which is not, while 8.2 real GDP is very good, 8.7 nominal GDP is not good. For us, we would ideally like a nominal GDP growth to be about 12%. Without that much buoyancy, government revenues will stagnate, you will have problems in meeting public expectations, and governments will face all sorts of fiscal pressures. A certain amount of inflation is necessary for India at this stage. Unfortunately, by tying ourselves to the rhetoric and narrative of inflation targeting and the need to keep inflation low, and many of us aspire to developed country status even before we become developed, so we would like to have inflation. The now target is 4%, and some people will say, why don't we do what the West is doing of having an inflation target of 2%, not realizing the consequences of what it does to nominal GDP growth and buoyancy of public revenues and so on and so forth. So there is a need to revisit some of these narratives. Unfortunately, the narratives are often influenced by the language of the developed world. And we adopt them at times without thinking. So I sort of thought I would bring these out to you, that we need to think about indicators, understanding where the indicators are, not blame the indicator itself, but try to understand what use we are putting it to. Is the use justified? Is the use itself rational? Is something which we don't often debate. So I will wrap my talk up by summarizing. Oh, this was a consequence of inflation targeting. The principal burden is posed by the manufacturing sector, which faces low producer prices, high borrowing cost, and a marketplace which is extremely uncompetitive for it. So, what is it that we leave? One, measurement takes time to evolve, and it often lags reality. Society changes much faster, and we need to work constantly to upgrade data to make sure that it keeps up with social development. It's not that the data is wrong, it's just that it has to evolve as fast as society is evolving. We often allow narratives to fill the gap, and the interpretation runs away with the discussion, often in far ahead of what the evidence would lead it to be. Narratives have persistence, which we need to combat. We need to recognize narrative. The inflation narrative is rooted in the experience of the 1970s. The principal authors on monetary policy, Milton Friedman and others, were writing after the experience of the inflation of the 70s. The world today is different, and we need to sort of break out of this a little. Some inflation is good. In fact, that is at the heart of what Donald Trump is doing to his country. He's actually inflating it out of trouble. He's trying to inflate it out of trouble. Whether he does or not, I don't know. But a lot of what he's doing goes against received economic wisdom, but may well be logical. Misalignment on these two distorts policy, and we need to sort of correct the alignment to get better actions. Finally, I would urge you all to understand data better. Don't criticize the data production purely on political, the grounds to say that this is politically motivated because it does not agree with your narrative. Question your narrative. It's very often, the data is often produced according to strict rules, and the rules may be obsolete and they need to be changed. But as long as they are produced according to the rules, you have to update your analysis. This is the belief I've long had as the chief statistician. We need to do this better. But one advice for the government also is the government needs to communicate more. Unfortunately, on matters of data, government communication has been very bad in the last few years, and there is a need to improve that. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this extraordinary lecture. I'm sure everyone would have a lot of questions, but let me begin with a few. I'll begin with a story from my own life. I joined a public sector unit after my BTech, and one of the questions which they used to ask every year, how many horses do you have? That was the annual form that we had to fill to tell them what kind of assets he had. They didn't ask us, how many phones you had, how many laptops, etc. Now, when they would have, then I left the public sector. When they updated the form, they would have found that the assets of BHL engineers expanded substantially. So this happens in the government sector, where the institutional forms of measurement, take a long time to be updated, and this is an example of that. Now, your lecture has raised a lot of questions. I will begin with 2 or 3 important ones, and these are so. Some of your work has highlighted the importance of communication note on which you ended. And as you have argued in one of pieces in Mint, government statistics at the end of the day, or any statistics, are collected through conversation, right? And this conversation happens at two stages. First of all, at the point of collection, and then finally when you communicate this. Now, and we are seeing that across a lot of democracies in the world, we have enormous political polarization. Now, and because of political polarization, conversation which is key to good quality statistics is not happening. So, do you see this as a major problem, and which is making the traditional forms of collecting data increasingly obsolete?
To some extent, probably that has happened. Data, let me distinguish between data collection and data communication of results. Insofar as data collection is concerned, uh, a large part of communication, the conversational challenge which is happening is, you know, survey, one of our mythologies of data in India is that there is a great emphasis placed on survey data, that survey data is somehow much better than administrative data. Administrative data problems are there, as you told, forms are obsolete, etc., reporting. But there is a belief that survey data is better. But survey data is now facing a huge challenge. Increasingly, people do not have the sort of time which a survey requires. And surveyors are facing a problem in India in that respect is not very different from developed countries in the world, where a large number of people are refusing to participate. The only solution is to reduce dependence on surveys. There is a lot of administrative data which is collected, which can be made use of. Unfortunately, we don't. Administrative data suffers from a basic weakness which exists in governance, is that governments find it most difficult to cooperate with each other. Or sometimes, if you think about it, within, say, the union government, departments find it difficult to talk to each other. There is a very famous episode in Yes, Prime Minister, where the cabinet secretary, or maybe Yes, Minister, where the principal secretary to the department identifies the other department as the enemy. You know, I don't remember the exact episode, but they were talking about the enemy and they were saying, is that France, is this? No, it's actually with reference to the neighboring department. So there's a huge reluctance to cooperate within the government itself. We are sitting on a data gold mine today. In fact, government, every department has modernized its forms. Like I told you with MCA, everybody is now online. All public services require you to fill up forms. They are very intrusive. They ask you a lot of questions before you are given access to the public service. All that data sits with government, but government doesn't know how to make use of it, and it does not want to share it with anybody who can. So each department sits on a data gold mine, but they have no mechanisms of sharing it. So that's the problem which they need to resolve if they want to improve on the collection side. The communication problem is very different. I wrote a piece last 2 weeks back on this episode which happened in Chennai, where customs good was imported, and this guy ran into trouble because the code which he used was not what the customs felt it should be used. Uh, it became viral on social media because allegations of corruption, which may well have taken place but are not central. The problem is of a coding structure which is archaic. We need to work on making the coding structure easy to use and more modern, reflecting modern conceptions. That's a larger problem, but that requires us to engage with the way global codes are set up. The consequences happen in India as well as in other parts of the world. And but what is happening is the debate which went off in social media went off in complete tangents. And Government often reacts to the social media dialogue in manners which are also not very productive. So you will blame people for being anti-national or whatever, and then it becomes problematic. It's much better to sort of try to keep the focus on this, or be like me, I'm not on social media.
The other thing that you mentioned towards the end is measurement lags reality. Now, in this very fast changing world with social media and deep polarization, uh, should the government surveys or statistics focus on precision or accuracy? I mean, are we really, interested in whether the poverty rate is 13.23%, or are we interested in knowing if the poverty change, I mean, if we are able to reliably estimate the direction of change of poverty? So, I mean, so if you're interested in accuracy, so then we'll do art surveys, and these surveys would take, 1 or 2 years. By the time the data come out, they're already obsolete. But so should we, also try to, introduce shorter surveys which can give us, but which can perhaps give us precision and give us an idea, a more frequent idea of the change, the direction of change?
Hard to answer that, but the, the difficulty is people, there are different expectations from what people want from a number. Ideally, you should do shorter and quick surveys because the data comes out quickly. The trouble is, you do a survey which is short and quick, it can only give you all India numbers. Somebody will say, but what about my district? I also want district level estimates. And the trouble is, we are overloading all of this onto the survey establishment. The moment you say, I want district level estimates and it to be done by a survey, the size is huge. You can't do it. The, at some point, we need to recognize that there are other ways. As I said, administrative data needs to be harnessed and used better. Very often, it is there to help you answer these questions, but we are not used to thinking about it. This is partly a legacy of our past. When we started our statistical journey in the 50s, administrative data was very poor and very limited, partly because public administration was not developmental in character, it did not have that focus. So we needed a quick answer. Sample surveys was a resolution to that problem. Subsequently to that, we have now created a huge development administration which captures enormous amounts of information for people on a variety of things. In order to get a house under Awas Yojana, you have to declare lots of things about yourself before that house comes in. All of that information is available for processing and mining, provided you find ways of making it usable. Increasingly, the usability has improved. All of it is Aadhaar linked. So you can actually integrate the information you give in one to information which is given elsewhere, and you can actually build up. The private sector is doing it very interestingly without having recourse to all of the computer systems and network are targeting uh, the experience you face to you using integrating things like cookies, which is there in every time you go to the computer, you get a response which is tailored specifically to you. But government is not willing to make use of the information it has.
And last question from my side, and then we'll open it for Q&A. You may to emphasize, the institutional aspect of statistical, work. Now, one of the things which you have been closely associated being the chief statistician was that in 1991, we'll go back a little bit, 1991, when we opened up the economy, the structure of political economy changed, substantially. We should have, so we had to overhaul our statistical systems, and but it took 10 years for the government to actually establish a commission to look at it. Now, the commission's report came out in 2000, 2001, and then it took another 10 years to about 7, 8 years to actually put in the machinery in place. and some of the recommendations were implemented, some were not implemented. So by the time the commission actually starts operating, we are already in 2011, 12, 13, and now we have the digital revolution, which again transforms the nature of political economy. So so this commission, which was supposed to respond to the 1990 crisis, is actually now faced with two, with the, is go- I mean, has to deal with another, alteration in political economy. So this slow process of institutional change, do you think that also plays a role in some of the controversies that we have had?
Well, to some extent it does. So, in fact, some of the things have been done, but government, as I said, is there is a certain inertia in government which is hard to combat. Let me give you an example. Uh, I think last year I was here in Bangalore. There was a labor economics conference which took place. So, as part of the conference, the government of Karnataka had tagged on a session on gig workers, gig and platform workers. Now, one complaint which the gig and platform workers were making is that government is not adequately supportive of us. Government says we don't have adequate data on this, and they said the data will not really be available until we can pass, which is what their agenda was. They had a bill which they have now passed for gig and platform workers in Karnataka. Now, the bill is fine. I think it meets a lot of things. Some of it has also been taken ahead by the fact that they have implemented the labor code. So many of the issues there have also been covered. But I'd said that there is another solution available to you. All platforms have databases because they all operate online. The databases are existing. You have recourse to a tool which will allow you to access statistics from from their thing under the Collection of Statistics Act, because as a consequence of the Rangarajan Commission and from in 2008, we'd already revised the Collection of Statistics Act to take account of this. But the Collection of Statistics Act is an act which is administered by the Statistics Department, which is under the Planning Commission in many of these states. Labor Ministry is a separate department. They'll have to work with the planning unit. So they said, oh, we could use this. I said, yes, you have the power. The power, or you don't have to wait for the act to be passed specifically for you when you have an enabling law which enables you to use it, but they have to work with another department. The heart of reform is making government work with each other.
Good evening. My name is Kaushik. I'm a chartered accountant. Thank you for a good session. While we tend to agree that narratives sometimes, precede or they overtake the numbers, is there also an element of intentionality that is sort of driving this behavior in people, in the sense that when you look at successive governments, it seems that the intentionality to reduce poverty is very minimal or sometimes even absent, which is why the focus is more on measuring the numbers or maybe changing the methodology, etc., rather than recognizing that, some of for different strata, these are the drivers of poverty, which is spending on healthcare or spending on education or spending on food, and therefore directly addressing them, increasing the coverage of that. And do you recognize that as a factor? And if so, then do you know why that is so among successive governments? There is this failure on intentionality.
Okay. So this is a lived experience of a lot of people that inflation data, GDP numbers, and a lot of the things we see in the newspapers and the television, they don't really match our lived experience. So when I see that inflation is 6% in an RBI report, it does not really match what I experience in life, right? A lot of the services which I use, a lot of the goods I use, the amount by which they go up every year is definitely not 6%. Again, a huge factor could be when I'm looking at the real estate market or at other assets. I guess those are not included in these matrices. So what would be one way to sort of get at an estimate key what might be really happening? If I'm earning 100 rupees and my salary is going up by 10% every year, how far behind or ahead of the economy am I? As a private citizen, what would be the best way to figure that out? What would be resources, or as not a professional economist, how can I look into it?
Hi. So I had a question. You were talking about institutional inertia, and like there's tends to be a lot of inertia when it comes to overhauling certain measurements or indexes. Specifically, when you talked about the household consumption expenditure survey, right, which is held every 5 years, which again doesn't measure different points of the year, seasonal employment and seasonal attitudinal shifts, versus say the periodic labor force survey, which has been recently reformed and is held, I think, every 3 months, right, quarterly. So even though these are both surveys organized by the same statistical body, the NSS, why is there a certain degree of inertia relating to the overhaul of one survey as opposed to the other, which can more or less use very similar mechanisms for how they carry out, how they carry out these particular surveys?
Let me take these three. Let me start with the last one because it's somewhat easiest to deal with. Uh, Inertia to a large extent happens, at least in survey this time, is because surveys are very expensive. If I PLFS, for example, which was supposed to be is a entirely new survey when it was launched. It was originally quarterly and now become monthly and so on and so forth. A completely new framework had to be created for it in terms of staffing, resources, because you need a regular permanent commitment. So that process of getting an expansion of a regular commitment is expensive, and it's not easy in government to get a permanent increase in your allocation for a new activity. In an ongoing flow, changing an activity from one objective to another and come back to it after 5 years is easier to do, which is why the HCA survey was pegged into the traditional activity profile, and it has been done. Now it will happen whenever. In order to make it a permanent thing, the government effort is quite considerable, and that's the simple answer. So inertia is built into the process by which approvals are given in government, particularly for additional funding. Okay, the second answer I'll turn to, I'm going back in reverse order. The lived experience of inflation. I mentioned that. I said inflation, what you experience is based on your level of expenditure and income and where you live. Now, for example, you live in Bangalore. Bangalore is still a very rapidly growing city. The South India in general is doing well economically. So Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai are all cities where a lot of people are coming in to look for work. So rentals in Bangalore will in general rise faster than rentals elsewhere in the country. We are not capturing inflation in Bangalore. And we are certainly not capturing inflation in Bangalore for the, say, top 10% of the expenditure class in Bangalore, which is what most urban professionals would fall into. The problem with the index is it's supposed to be the inflation of the average or median Indian. Now you have to keep in mind who is the median Indian and where is he or she likely to live. The chances are the median Indian lives in a semi-urban or area or maybe a rural area in probably one of the more populous states. And you have to talk in terms of what experience will he have. So that's partly why lived experience of inflation is very different. It's not just different here, it's different globally. You need to just go onto social media and you will find the same outrage taking place in the US, where they'll say, our inflation is very high, because most of the people who are raising this are people who are living in communities which are seeing very high rise in living costs because of various service elements going up for them. Now, first one, the thing about intentionality in poverty. Actually, governments have typically been ahead of the curve on intentionality, ahead of us as statisticians and economists in changing our definition. Governments introduced public support to healthcare long before we are able to introduce it in our measurement protocols as a required thing of minimum expenditure. I think in Karnataka they had I think it was what Yashaswini scheme long back, and now Government of India has a insurance scheme to provide people with minimum support for insurance, at least for hospitalization. So some things governments are ahead of, and in some state governments they are even providing support for private tuition. So it's not that governments are not there's a lack of intentionality in poverty elevation. That intentionality doesn't translate into our understanding of poverty. We are still anchored in debates hooked onto a measurement protocol set in the 70s. That debate is obsolete. We need to evolve a measurement protocol which is suitable to our time. There is a certain lack of intentionality, but there the fault is not so much in the government, it's in also us. If the government today were to announce that it wants to change the poverty measurement protocol, there'll be outrage. I mean, why do you want to do that? The fact is, you do need to do it. When Alag Commission had measured poverty using its norm, the poverty level was 65%, and people were saying it's probably higher, which may well have been true. That was the nature of reality then. People did not have enough to eat, but that was pre-Green Revolution. Green Revolution has changed that. Food is not the problem. We have other problems. But our measurement protocol simply does not have the wherewithal to pick them up because we don't let it.
Thank you. A fascinating discussion. You mentioned that there is enough administrative data which the government is not tapping into. Is that because of a lack of capacity, capability, prioritization? What is going on there?
Good evening. Thank you for a very enlightening session. And my question is, you mentioned that there is a lag in data collection and whatever the trends that are happening in society. So with the advent of IT, with the advent of AI, will there be any scope of live, data which will change the way everything is happening today? Maybe down 2 years, 3 years?
Thank you, sir, for a really insightful talk. I have a twofold question for you. When you were talking about poverty, you mentioned the changing descriptive factors for the measurement. But if you change the subjective terms of your measurement criteria, does that not change your baseline? How would we compare to the previous data points? That is the first part of my question. And secondly, I want to ask, do national measures hold value in a country like India, where disparity is so high? So we spoke about lived experience of inflation. If we take per capita income, we have a certain number given to us that is considered the average for the country. However, if we remove the top 10%, your number drops down to less than half of that. So how do we measure that in India? Should it be state-wise? Should we have 5 different economies? How do we measure aggregate values in a country like India?
What was your first one? Second one was on heterogeneity.
Baseline. If we change the subjective terms of our measurement, are we not able to compare to our baseline anymore?
Okay, let's take these three. First, about administrative data use. Here, the challenge is actually more within government. There's been a lot of talk about how government needs to change the way it does business, and primarily with regard to this. I can only refer you to a newspaper column which I wrote some time back, where I highlighted that some improvements have taken place, and that is largely, at least at the union government level, and similar things in many states have been seen, where the government of the day is very actively involved in pushing cooperation across departments. And in the union government, there was a model which the current government, Prime Minister Modi in his first term had adopted, of something called Pragati, where the Prime Minister himself would chair a meeting where chief secretaries and others would be present, and things which are held up would be flagged. It so happened that the way Pragati worked, and since I had the privilege of watching it work for a little while, moment an item got included in the agenda, Suddenly, interdepartmental meetings would be scheduled in very quick time. Meetings would be set up with state government chief secretaries. Time would become available, and what seemed to be insurmountable problems had just vanished. Uh, there are ways to solve it, but government has to take a proactive view on it, and sometimes governments get caught up with other immediate concerns of their time, and these issues, there is a certain inertia which reasserts itself. So that's a challenge to which the answer is simple, but applying it is very difficult. Technology and data collection actually has made a huge difference. Technology has speeded up data collection a lot. I'll give you one example. NSS surveys are now, the reports are released within 6 months or sometimes 3 months after the close of the survey date. And we are updating our reports very fast. One example of this is the government has announced that it will release the revised GDP series in 26 with a base year of 22-23. That means a gap between the base year and the revision date is only 3 years. If you look back to what happened in 99-2000, the revision was based in the year 99-2000. The revised series was released in 2006. There was a gap of almost 7 years, and that 7-8 year gap was there all the way back. That's because of faster availability of many survey results which go into the national accounts calculation. Technology has made a big use in government's own data collection. Government itself is collecting a lot of data, and some cases we are making use of it. I'll give you 2 examples. One is the MCA data, which we are making use of in national accounts. This was earlier inaccessible. A second is international trade data. The Ministry of Commerce collects all import and export information online, and by the end of the month's trade figures, preliminary estimates are out. We have made huge improvements in many areas of data collection. But while I acknowledge all these improvements, there are these challenges which I point out. There are lots of new data which you need to evolve protocols to develop. Last set. The input of when I change measurement, will I maintain comparability? This is a very good question, and there's no good answer to it. I think Vikas will remember when I reviewed his book, I made this point as well there, that improvements in data quality create a problem for academicians. They have invested in a narrative which is built up on an earlier, poorer data quality, and now the number is better. How do you deal with this improved number? The example is from Vikas's book. The 2001 census estimates of Nagaland were poor. The 2011 census estimates of Nagaland were much better because a lot of effort went into making the number better. The consequence was that if you compare 2001 unmodified to 2011, the population of Nagaland drops. Now that becomes a problem. Is the number good, or is what went wrong? What went wrong was what is there in his book. So this problem is there, but we have to be better analysts to deal with this problem. It's the data quality improvement should not be linked to our inability to adapt. What was the other thing? Something. I wrote something. National numbers. National numbers. We had this discussion just now. There's a challenge. You want numbers quickly. He wants numbers relevant to describing his reality. We want both. We want the description to be granular, to capture it, and another person says, I want it fast. Some of it will happen. Technology will make it possible, is making it possible. If you make better use of administrative data and you were able to subject government records to the same tools of analytics which Google or others are doing, you could develop much more precise targeted profiles. The information exists. there is a need to change in government to make better use of it. Remember one thing: the embargoes to the impediments to this are not merely at the level. The impediments are also there in the legal system, in activists, concerns about privacy. There are all sorts of issues which you start taking into. I'm talking to you about a possibility, but before converting that possibility into reality, you will have to negotiate your way through all these challenges as well.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your brilliant talk. It was truly enlightening. So, a lot of policies are what govern the median Indian nationals' lives. And when we think about their lived experiences, they always point out how the scale is always lagging and falls short to the actual necessities of such a citizen. And they point out the red tape, or like you have mentioned, the interdepartmental cold wars. And there might be other reasons behind this. Could you tell us a little more about it and what you would propose to address these challenges?
Professor, you mentioned a little about Nagaland. I was there the year before last, and in many places, nearly every house has a car, if not two cars. That's the ground reality. I have personally seen it. And there's a traffic jam in Kohima, it's better to walk. Secondly, a minister, I was privy to a minister talking in a public policy discussion, and I am here. A minister, while being a minister, he said, I went to my constituency to see how many people are below the particular line, poverty line or whatever, in which you are not supposed to have a TV set, a washing machine, a fridge, a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler. So he said, in my own constituency, when I reached the outskirts, they held me up there for a little bit of tea and talk. Then I realized at the other end of the village, there's a big posse going out in a rush. All people are taking out their TVs, fridges, washing machines, two-wheelers and four-wheelers and running away to the nearby village because he was coming into this village to meet people. So how reliable is data?
Yeah, I think my question is similar to the one that the lady had asked earlier, but slightly different in terms of if you look at, if you're measuring poverty from a perspective of providing a lot of emphasis on food consumption at a certain point in time, and today you say that I want to measure poverty based on access to cell phones or access to healthcare, etc., then how are you going to say whether we have become more affluent as a country or less affluent as a country? Or have you managed to, how do you know whether your policies have helped reduce hunger? How are you measuring those things if you just choose to change the measure itself?
You know, I don't really have an answer to the red tape and questions and so on. The fact is, answering those is somewhat outside. I was bringing those up as an example of how they affect statistics, but reforming those, there are actually a fair amount of good advice which is already there. And it's not for lack of advice on these matters. It's really a question of finding a way to get it implemented. So I'm sorry, I'm not really answering the question, but I'm just saying it's some. The thing about reliability of data, you know, this example which you gave, there is a huge amount of strategic interplay which takes place. Specifically when it becomes clear that the data which I'm collecting is to be used for a particular social policy objective. This certainly takes place when I try to define poverty lines or BPL status by access to certain types of assets. People will try to game it. It is taking place now with regard to people strategically gaming what response they should give to their caste. And there are dial. This is a challenge for data quality. There is no denying that. When I referred to Goodhart's law and there are related law of Campbell's law, they all talk about the fact that when statistical data is used for policy, it sets in place a strategic loop which influences the data collection process. And we need to be aware of it. There are two answers to it. One is we try to develop measures which are neutral to policy, which are not, that's possible. There are answers which say that let's not try to capture certain types of information, which is subject to a lot of strategic manipulation. France refuses to collect data on religion. It's explicitly banned by their constitution. The government will not inquire into people's religion. Now, we have not thought enough about these, because these are things which we need to think about, because one side of us says we need to quantify everything in terms of religion. And I've had this debate at a very senior level in government, where people said we should be classifying people as to whether they get treatment or not based on their religious identity. I said, just think about the implications of asking people their religious status at the time of admission to a hospital. Is that something you want to introduce? Because it has consequences. Because moment you introduce that, it may influence the way that organization functions. These are challenges which we need to worry about. We don't often worry about them, and that's a problem. Finally, the answer to your question about the old issue has not completely gone away. But if I change the measure, will I ignore the old issue? There is a risk of that happening, but my concern is as follows. Too much of our debating time is lost, our time is lost by debating things which are obvious to everybody. Fact is, the number of people who have enough to eat has increased enormously. Yes, there are pockets where hunger still persists. It may increasingly be the case that our tools are inadequate to capture them, because survey-based instruments are very poor in identifying isolated regional pockets, because the instrument is not designed for that. So persistent hunger in a far-flung region in Odisha or in Jharkhand may happen, but our instrument is not adequate for it. So that's a separate problem. The reason why we have to update the measurement protocol is because fundamentally poverty measurement is not about comparability over time, but to meet a moral norm, that it is unacceptable to us that some people live outside of what we today take as minimal requirements, which means that norm has to keep evolving, because what is minimally required today is not the same as what was minimally required in 1970. So to me, it is unacceptable that we are unwilling to revise the norm. We should revise the norm as certain things become taken for given. I mean, that they must be happening. So I would argue, even if it compromises your comparability over time, let's go ahead and do it.